tremendous congratulations again to both Lauren and Marnie. And so now on to this evening's talk. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Paul Barnaby, who is Modern Literary Collections Curator at the University of Edinburgh. He's written and spoken extensively on a wide range of literature and literary cultures, especially Scottish, including speaking at the recent International Walter Scott Conference, and recent papers and publications include The Young Person Sir Walter Scott, Scott and the 19th Century Child Reader, and Sir Walter Scott in Translation, focusing on the French Ivanhoe. He's also addressed the club before in 2010 on That Mighty Treasure, the Corson Collection. He's, however, perhaps best known for his astoundingly valuable work on the Walter Scott Digital Archive, and I'm sure many of us have used that treasure trove on many an occasion. It's a core resource of information on the life and work of Walter Scott. And this evening, as you can see, the focus of Paul's talk will be the collaboration between James Skene and Walter Scott. So Paul, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure to be here. Tonight's talk is an illustrated talk, but some of the images I'm going to be showing are quite small in the first place, and in some cases a little faint, and they don't all work terribly. They're not all going to work terribly well, I'm afraid, but you may need to assist matters with your imagination a little bit at moments. But I think that they're all valuable to show for one reason or another. Now. So, yes, I thought I'd begin with a bit of an introduction about James Skene then. So, artist, antiquarian, traveller, secretary of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and curator of its library and museum, secretary to the Board of Trustees for Manufacturers in Scotland and to the Institution for the Encouragement of the Fine Arts in Scotland, founding member of the Ballantine Club, member of the Society of Antiquaries, designer of Edinburgh's Princes Street Gardens. A man of extensive literary, artistic and scientific knowledge, James Skene of Rubislaw is an accomplished figure in his own right. He is nonetheless best known for his decades-long friendship and artistic collaboration with Sir Walter Scott, which I'm going to explore this evening via a recently rediscovered album of sketches by Skene purchased by Edinburgh University Library in 2021. A talented amateur artist, Skene will accompany Scott on riding excursions to locations that Scott planned to feature in his novels. There, at Scott's suggestion, Skene made sketches of scenery and buildings that Scott then used as visual prompts for his famously vivid descriptions. Some sketches in the album can be directly linked to trips that Scott and Skene are known to have made together. Other, later sketches date from excursions that Skene took alone at Scott's request, as Scott himself grew ever busier and, with declining health, less physically mobile. So the album, show you, this is the cover obviously, the album contains circa 420 sketches in pencil or in gouache, the size of which varies considerably, where there are mostly 1 or 2 sketches per page. In some cases, there are as many as 5 or 6. To give you some idea of the scale here, pages are 51 by 31 centimetres. Now, we bought the album at auction in March 2021. The previous owner, who's kindly forwarded his own research into the album, was James Will, who inherited it in 1971 from his grandfather, D. Allen Stevenson, the last lighthouse engineer in the Stevenson family of engineers. It seems likely, without any hard evidence, that D. Allen Stevenson himself bought the album at auction in the 1950s. When he acquired a lot of auction materials while researching his definitive history of the world's lighthouses before 1820, which was published in 1959. The 1950s also saw a good deal of James Skene material come onto the market. Skene holdings in the National Galleries of Scotland, Edinburgh Libraries, and the National Library of Scotland were all bought at around this time. It's possible, however, that the collection was acquired by the Stevenson family at an earlier date. James Will's great-great-great-grandfather, Robert Stevenson, builder of the Bell Rock Lighthouse, was a friend of both Scott and Skene. When he published an account of the lighthouse's construction in 1824, it was accompanied by a frontispiece illustration by J.M.W. Turner, which was based on an architectural drawing by Skene, who incidentally owned the quarry from which the stones to build the lighthouse were extracted. The meeting between Skene and Turner was brokered by Scott on Stevenson's behalf. 50 years later, Stevenson's grandson, Robert Louis Stevenson, was apprenticed to the law firm Skene Edwards, in which James Skene's son, William Forbes Skene, was a senior partner, suggesting a continuing close connection between the two families. Our sketch album, incidentally, shows further evidence of Skene's own interest in lighthouse engineering, including this hair-raising image of Fraserburgh Lighthouse. So, in all likelihood, the album was bought at an auction in the 50s, but we can't exclude the possibility of a longer connection between the Skene and Stevenson families here. So, the sketches in the album date from Skene's student years to shortly after Scott's death in 1832. To give a brief account of Skene's life, he was born just outside Aberdeen on the 7th of March 1775. So 4 years Scott's junior. His father, George Skene, Laird of Rubislaw, died 1 year later, and he was brought up by his mother, Jean Moyer, a strong-willed and unconventional woman who in her youth shocked her contemporaries by, to quote the editor of Skene's Memories of Scott, such extravagances as making an annual journey to Edinburgh on horseback in a scarlet riding habit. In 1783, Jean moved her young family to Edinburgh for schooling, and here Skene revealed an early talent for drawing, taking great delight in sketching the buildings of the capital's old town. The whole course of Skene's life changed in 1791, however, when his only brother George tragically died at the age of 21, making Skene heir to the lucrative Rubislaw estate. As his education had been neglected in his brother's favour, the 16-year-old Skene was promptly sent to study in Germany. Whether Skene precisely complied with his family's wishes on arrival in Germany is questionable. Rather than study at an ancient university, his passion for drawing led him to enroll at the prestigious art school, the Zeichen Drawing Academy at Hanau near Frankfurt. The earliest drawing in the album, in fact, shows Skene's digs in Hanau and may well be a student exercise. Now, despite the map of Scotland on Skene's wall, it's just over the table to the right, and an increasingly alarming international situation, he does not seem to have suffered homelessness. The year 1793, in fact, saw French revolutionary troops enter Frankfurt and France declare war on Britain, but Skene resisted his mother's increasingly frantic pleas to return to Scotland. He eventually made a leisurely return in 1794 with a fluent knowledge of French and German and a library of the latest German literature. He subsequently read law at Edinburgh University and was called to the Scottish Bar in 1797, although having considerable private means, he doesn't seem to have practised extensively. It was Skene's library of German literature that first brought him into contact with Scott. In the early 1790s, Scott, of course, discovered the proto-romantic Sturm und Drang school of German poets and dramatists, and like many contemporaries, he was excited by their rejection of neoclassical conventions, their openness to folk tradition and emotional intensity. He began studying German in order to read these works in the original, and his earliest publications were translations from two of the movement's leading lights, Gottfried August Burger. So these are items from the Corson collection. That's an inscribed copy from Scott to the poet Anna Seward, and of course Johann Wolfgang Goethe, the Scots translation there of Goetz and Bellichigen with the mistaken Christian name William Scott corrected to Walter in hand. So in 1794, Scott learned that Skene had returned from Hanau with an enviable collection of German writing. An introduction was arranged, and Skene gladly granted Scott access to his library. Their friendship was truly cemented, however, in 1797, when both served in the Edinburgh Light Horse, a voluntary regiment established to defend against the French invasion. In his posthumously published Memories of Scott, Skene recalls how one canto of Marmion was composed on horseback on the regiment's drill ground at Portobello Sands. During their manoeuvres, Skene writes, Sir Walter was often seen dodging up and down on his black gelding at the very edge of the sea in complete abstraction. He used to join me in the rear of the squadron when returning from exercises and recite what he'd been composing. The first three cantos of the earlier Lay of the Last Minstrel, the poem that obviously catapulted Scott to fame, were composed, Skene tells us, when Scott was confined to barracks in Musselburgh for 3 days following a kick from a horse. Scott's training with the Edinburgh Light Horse also inspired episodes in the Waverley novels. The Antiquary concludes with a false alarm of a French invasion that unites the warring community of Fairport against a common enemy. As Skene shows, it's closely based on a mistaken report of a French landing in Aberlady Bay, which led to cliff-top beacons being lit across the Lothians and volunteer troopers pouring into Edinburgh from over 60 miles away. Skene and 2 colleagues were in Fife when they saw the beacons and embarked upon a hazardous midnight crossing of the Forth. We landed early in the morning and galloped off to the rendezvous of the Corps. Learning the mistake, we put up our horses and proceeded to breakfast with Sir Walter and to laugh over our exploits. What began as duty turned into pleasure, though, as Skene joined Scott on horseback rambles across the border region, alighting where any scene attracted their notice, for Skene to sketch landscape and antiquities, and for Scott to, quote, con over some appropriate ballad or narrate the traditions of the Glen, and sometimes, but rarely, to note in his book some passing ideas, for in general his memory was the great storehouse on which he confidently relied for all occasions. Particularly after Scott rented the country house of Ashestiel in 1804, this is a sketch of Ashestiel by Skene. Skene would spend much of the summer with Scott and embark on lengthy explorations, during which there were few subjects of border history or romance, and scarcely a portion of the scenery of the border counties, however secluded and remote, that we did not explore. Vividly evoked in Skene's posthumously published memoir, their excursions took them to localities that Scott later depicted in his literary works. Skene recalls, for example, how a ride through Muffetdale, past the Grey Mare's Tail waterfall and the dark mountain town of Loch Skene, provided the moorland setting for much of old mortality. Now, our album contains 2 sketches of the Grey Mare's Tail made during this very trip, though unfortunately neither shows up very well in digitised form. I'm going to show the next couple of plates with extreme misgivings because they're in very faint pencil work on very dark paper, and with the best will in the world, they don't really. You have to peer very closely at these and use your imagination to make out that the scene depicted here is roughly this. We actually have the things in front of you, it's perfectly clear. Unfortunately, after various attempts, this is, these are about as clear a digital reproduction as we can have. I just thought these are worth showing despite everything, as they're obviously, the oldest record in the album of Skene's creative relationship with Scott. So where were we? Yes. On another extended ride, Scott and Skene met an eccentric huntsman, whom Scott would later introduce as Todd Gabby in his 1815 novel Guy Mannering. This character, whose real name is Todd Willie, accompanied the friends on a fox hunt which Scott asked Skene to sketch for posterity. Again, the drawings form part of an album and show Skene's willingness to act as a visual record keeper for his friend. They show up a little bit better. So this is Skene's sketch of Todd Willie, taken in, I think it was 1808. And here is a further, slightly less clear sketch of the fox hunt itself. Other trips described in Skene's memoir include a visit to Scott's friend John Morritt at Rugby Park, Yorkshire, where Scott again asked Skene to sketch details of scenery that he would introduce into his narrative poem Rugby in 1812. The pair also visited a farm belonging to the father of Scott's friend and subsequent factor, William Laidlaw, in Blackhouse, Southwickshire. Skene argues that the patriarchal Laidlaw Senior provides the original for the border farmers portrayed in Guy Mannering and other Waverley novels. Our album contains a sketch, again dated, the early ones, that's 1808, the early ones were 1804, yeah. Our album again contains a sketch, again dated September 1804, of the farm and the adjoining ruins of Blackhouse Tower, which Scott identifies as the setting for the ballad The Douglas Tragedy in the minstrelsy of the Scottish border. and it has also been proposed as the model of the ruined tower in which Harry Bertram hides from smugglers in chapter 37 of Guy Mannering. Now, while these sketches predate the composition of the earliest Waverley novels by over a decade, there are scenes that Scott asked Skene to record, as he sensed that they held creative potential. Skene's sketches capture then the first spark of inspiration, the seeding of ideas that would slowly germinate in Scott's mind. These years of outdoor camaraderie and informal artistic collaboration are commemorated in the epistle to Skene that prefaces Canto 4 of Marmion in 1808. 11 years, yes, here we go. 11 years we now may tell since we have known each other well, since riding side by side our hand first drew the voluntary brand, and sure through many a varied scene unkindness never came between. And he goes on to recall the shepherd who in summer sun had something of her envy won, as thou with pencil, I with pen, the features traced of hill and glen. Now, ironically, the publication of Marmion was followed by a hiatus in Skene's friendship with Scott. In 1808, Skene moved to Aberdeenshire following his marriage to Jane Forbes, daughter of the banker Sir William Forbes of Pitsligo. For 8 years, Skene lived the life of a country gentleman at Invery House near Bankery, several sketches of which are to be found in the album. There's a couple here then. This is his estate at Invery with a house in the background. Yes, another sketch of part of the estate. Their friendship was revived in 1816 when Skene returned to Edinburgh for his children's education, to find Scott simultaneously engaged in writing the early Waverley novels and constructing his plaything in stone, Abbotsford House. Skene's role as one of the so-called Committee of Taste, who helped Scott design Abbotsford, is well known. Along with Edward Bloor and Daniel Terry, he served as an artistic consultant whom Scott employed to flesh out his own ideas on paper. Skene also recalls securing historical artefacts for Scott that were absorbed into the building or grounds of Abbotsford. These include the Gothic door of the Black Turnpike, the 15th century building in which Mary Queen of Scots was imprisoned, that stood immediately to the west of the Tron Kirk in Edinburgh and was demolished in 1788 to create room for South Bridge. Skene also used his influence with the town council to obtain for Scott the sculptured heads of Scottish kings that adorned the original Merfolk Cross of Edinburgh that was pulled down in 1756. And these were then subsequently incorporated into the garden wall at Abbotsford. Our album indicates, however, that at the same time Skene was sketching scenery and historical buildings that Scott used as visual references when writing the Waverley novels. Skene, of course, was in on the secret of Scott's authorship. In his memories of Scott, he writes that he was not much in Scott's company when Scott was writing Waverley itself, which was published in 1814 when Skene was still in Aberdeenshire. On reading it, he strongly suspected that Scott was the author, but cannot be entirely certain. Scott's second novel, Guy Mannering, however, entirely confirmed his suspicions, as not only did, quote, the identity of my friend shine forth in every chapter, but Scott had the smuggler Dirk Hatterick sing a German drinking song that Skene had taught him. In particular, our album contains scenes associated with Scott's 1820 novel, The Abbot. These include atmospheric sketches of Niddry and Crookstone castles that Scott either took in... Every time I talk about Skene and Scott, I get them mixed up. Every time I'm talking about Skene and Scott's... Skene's scenes of Scottish scenery by Scott. Bear with me. These include atmospheric sketches of Niddry and Crookstone castles that Skene either took in Scott's company or scouted at Scott's request. Now, in chapter 34 of The Abbot, Mary and her followers take refuge in Niddry Castle following her escape from captivity. So here's Skene's sketch in Niddry Castle. And in chapter 37, she witnesses the final defeat of her army at the Battle of Langside from the vantage point of Crookstone Castle. Scott follows tradition in stationing Mary in the shade of a yew tree in the castle grounds, though he disarmingly confesses in the introduction to the magnum opus that he knows this tradition to be mistaken, and that Mary really watched the battle from nearby Cathcart Castle. So here, again, one of the clearer ones, this is Skene's sketch of Crookside Castle on its eminence, if you like, and it brings to mind the following lines from the novel itself. Getting the Queen's little retinue in some order for marching, he led them to the left, directing his course towards a castle, which, crowning a gentle yet commanding eminence, presented an extensive view over the country beneath, and in particular commanded a view of those heights which both armies hastened to occupy, and which it was now apparent must almost instantly be the scene of struggle and dispute. There's also this perhaps slightly better picture of Crookston Castle later in the album. Now, the album also contains a number of views of the Firth of Clyde. This one. Some of these may essentially be holiday snaps, as Skene frequently rented summer lodgings in Largs. Suggestively, though, this is also a landscape through which Jeannie Deans travels en route to Argyllshire, in Book 4 of The Heart of Midlothian. That's another one. And the 1818 dating of these sketches suggests that some of these may have served as compositional aids for Scott. Unrelated to Scott, there's also this rather striking watercolour of a Largs fair. Another sketch from this period is evidence of the exceptional closeness of the friendship between Scott and Skene. For 2 years, from 1819 to 20, Scott, of course, suffered an agonising and almost fatal attack of gallstones, which in Skene's account aged him 20 years and robbed him of, quote, much of his former vigour. Skene was a frequent visitor at Scott's bedside, and reports that one day Scott turned to him and said with a smile, "If you'll promise not to laugh at me, I have a favour to ask. Do you know, I've taken a childish desire to see the place where I am to be laid when I go home, which there is some probability may not now be long delayed. Now, as I cannot go to Dryburgh Abbey, that's out of question at present, it would give me much pleasure if you would take a ride down and bring me a drawing of that spot." And he described the position minutely and the exact point from which he wished the drawing to be made, at the site of his future grave might appear. Our album contains a drawing of Scott's burial place in St Mary's Isle, again a little faint, in St Mary's Isle, Dryburgh Abbey, which may well be the sketch that Skene took on this occasion. Yeah, that's not terribly clear. It's a picture of this, a Victorian engraving of the Abbey as a site of tourist pilgrimage. Scott once again turned to Skene for emotional support in the wake of the collapse of his publisher Archibald Constable and printer James Ballantyne in 1826, which saddled Scott with enormous debt. Scott's journal refers to restorative walks in Princes Street Gardens with Good Samaritan Skene, a friend in time of need, when others were, quote, too busy or too gay. Indeed, their friendship appears to have intensified following Scott's financial disaster. These years, in fact, see the only published evidence of their artistic collaboration to have appeared in either's lifetime. Skene's, snappily titled, a series of sketches of the existing localities alluded to in the Waverley novels, henceforth, sketches of the localities of the Waverley novels. Now, if Scott had had his way, their collaboration would have borne much earlier and more evident fruit. From about 1819 onwards, he encouraged the publicity-shy Skene to collaborate as co-author and illustrator of two joint projects, the Antiquitates Ricianae, or Riciana, a book devoted to the antiquities and ancient manners of Edinburgh, and a second, more scholarly project on the domestic architecture of Scotland. These ventures were stymied by a combination of, one, Skene's lengthy residence in Provence, 1820 to 21, for his wife's health, two, Scott's post-1826 financial difficulties, and three, Skene's sheer reluctance to publish. But following Scott's death, Skene did in fact complete manuscripts of both works, which are held by Edinburgh Central Library. Scott had also made earlier unsuccessful attempts to persuade Skene to publish the journals and sketches of a European tour or sentimental journey that he took in 1802-3. The sketches of the localities of the Waverley novels were, however, brought out by Scott's publisher Robert Cavell in 21 instalments between 1829 and 31. The instalments were originally intended to appear simultaneously with the 48 volumes of the magnum opus. Skene, however, who etched the illustrations from his own sketches, was unable to maintain that schedule. Skene discusses this project in his Memories of Scott, writing that, quote, "Many of the real localities of the Waverley novels were connected with my collection of drawings, of which a part had been made at Scott's suggestion, many during the various excursions we made together. and not a few in countries where Sir Walter had never been, though he had taken the descriptions from the drawings I possessed. Scott himself persuaded Cadell, but a volume of his localities, selected by Scott and Skene together, might be, quote, found interesting. Now, our album contains drawings for 24 of the 64 etched illustrations that appear in Skene's sketches of the localities of the Waverley novels. In some instances, the drawings appear to be original sketches made during Skene's rambles with Scott. This is the case, for example, for the images we've seen of Todd Gabby's fox hunt or Nidri Castle, which are clearly recognisable in Skene's etched illustrations. So, in the published series of sketches, this is Skene's etching of the fox hunt and featuring Todd, Willie or Gabby, and here is his etching of Nidri Castle. In the majority of cases, however, the drawings in our album clearly post-date the publication of the related Scott novels, and in fact most appear to have been made specifically for the published sketches of the localities of the Waverley novels in the years 1829 to 30. In his correspondence, Skene speaks of revisiting localities while working on the volume, and, for the sake of accuracy, making new versions of drawings, quote, taken many years ago in Scott's company. This is the case, for example, with the images of Craigneven Castle in Lanarkshire, the purported original of Tillytudley in Old Mortality. So here, that's the sketch in our album, Craigneven Castle, and here's the etching in the published volume. Or to show it's not all castles, these two images of Eyemouth, the setting for much of the Bridal Lammermoor. So here's one image of Eyemouth, and here's from the album, and here's the etched version. Again, these aren't the clearest ones. And here, another drawing of Eyemouth, which is turned into this etching. Our album then contains a mixture of original sketches made with or for Scott, and updated versions made for publication in sketches of the localities of the Waverley novels. Now, in addition to our newly acquired Skene album, Edinburgh University's Corson Collection Scott Materials contains a unique copy of Skene's published sketches of the localities of the Waverley novels, and this is so much easier to actually explain with a copy in hand, so bear with me, where pasted on the verso of 60 of the 64 etchings is not Skene's original sketch, but a reduced scale 13 by 8 centimetre version of the sketch on tracing paper from which the etching was directly made. So this is what the published etchings look like. Here's the published etching of Stirling Castle with a bit of facing text, giving a brief sort of historical and topographical account. Now, in our copy, pasted on the back of that sketch, there is a reduced size copy of the original drawing of Skene's original drawing of Stirling Castle on tracing paper. To look at that a bit more closely, here is the published etching in close-up, and here is the drawing, the wash drawing of Stirling Castle from our recently acquired sketch album. And here is the reduced scale version of that pasted onto the back of the etching. Now, you'll notice that in the process of adaptation, Gently Grazing Castle, on this image, have been turned into a troop of Jacobite cavalrymen, portraying the scene in chapter 39 of Waverley, where the Laird of Balmawhapple fires a pistol shot against the battlements of Stirling Castle. Our Corson collection also contains the manuscript of a second unpublished volume of sketches of the localities of the Waverley novels. The first published volume covered the Waverley novels up to the Abbot, 1820. The second volume takes up the Waverley sequence at Kenilworth. It contains 51 sketches set up for etching but not actually etched, and it allocates space for 30 more. Now, while some of the missing sketches may have been lost or removed, it's likely that the manuscript was never completed, as only 12 sketches have detailed accompanying text. Of particular interest to Scots scholars are the sketches illustrating Quentin Durward, set in France and Belgium, and Anne of Geierstein, set in Switzerland and Provence. Scott had not visited these locations and, as shown by his journal and correspondence, drew extensively for inspiration on Skene's European travel diaries and sketches. Skene's sketch album for his 1820 to 21 travels in Provence, Switzerland and Italy is held by the National Galleries of Scotland. But the whereabouts of his travel diaries and the sketches of his 1802 to 3 tour of Belgium, Germany, Switzerland and Italy, which was sold at auction in 1952, is unknown. The sketches in the incomplete MS of the second series of sketches of localities of the Waverley novels are then, particularly for Quentin Durward, the only available record of the visual stimuli that Skene provided for Scott. Here, for example, are 2 sketches vividly portraying the northeastern French and Belgian landscape in which the final chapters of Quentin Durward are set. They depict, firstly here, the rich valley of the Meuse, and the district of La Marque, lair of William de la Marque, the wild boar of the Ardennes, whose brutal murder of the Bishop of Liège triggers the novel's climax. Now, there's not a particularly strong connection between our newly acquired Skene album and the manuscript second series of sketches of the localities of the Waverley novels. Only 2 of the drawings prepared for etching appear to derive from sketches in our album, both of castles featured in Scott's Dumfriesshire set novel Red Gauntlet. So there's so here is in the manuscript second series of the sketches of the localities. Here's Skene's reduced scale drawing of 3 castles set up for etching, and here is the original of the faint drawing in our album. And here is from the unpublished manuscript, the reduced scale version of the a drawing of Lancs Castle, historical seat of Clan Grierson, whom Scott transformed into the titular Red Gauntlet family. And here is again a rather faint image in our recently acquired album, which is plainly the source for that. The album in the sketch in the manuscript. And so just to stress that the subject matter of the sketches in and drawings in our newly acquired album are almost all Scottish. Why then was the second volume of sketches of the localities of the Waverley novels not completed or published? In his Memories of Scott, Skene writes that, quote, the minuteness of the work necessary to bring the scale of the engravings to the size of the novels made it too severe a strain upon the eyes, leading him to discontinue the project. Now, the unique copy of the first volume of sketches in the Corson collection certainly vividly evokes the intricacy of the work involved in this process, which, as we have seen, first necessitates in making a reduced-size version of the original drawings. Correspondence held by the National Library of Scotland suggests, however, that Scott's reasons for abandoning the second volume of sketches may be more complex. In May 1830, when Skene had completed 15 of the 21 instalments of the first series of sketches, he was approached by the publisher Charles Tilt, who had launched his deluxe landscape illustrations of the Waverley novels. Tilt suggested that rather than pursue rival projects, he and Skene joined forces, with Skene providing sketches to be polished and engraved by Tilt's team of professional artists. With Scott's blessing, Skene acceded to Tilt's proposal, writing that he'd be glad to see his present undertaking draw to a close, as, quote, I begin to find the etching irksome to the eyes. Subsequent correspondence with John Martin, who edited Tilt's landscape illustrations, indicates a further reason. Skene writes, having now completed 1 volume, and feeling the minuteness rather irksome to my eyes, and the confined scale of the subjects injurious as to effect, in my hands at least, compared with the original sketches, I've suspended proceedings during the present dark season, and have some doubts as to whether I may muster resolution enough to resume it again in summer. This suggests that Skene's belittling of his work in the preface to the published first series of etchings as, quote, the crude productions of an amateur draftsman, lacking, quote, any merit beyond that of strict fidelity, may be more than false modesty, and reveal genuine dissatisfaction with the results. Contemporary critics, in fact, damned the etchings with faint praise. The Spectator noted that they were executed in a very homely manner, but not without feeling and spirit, while William Jerden, in the Literary Gazette, remarked that Skene would do well to have them re-outlined on steel. Now, as Richard Hill has noted, Skene was working just as the engraving trade was undergoing a rapid process of professionalisation, thanks to new steel engraving technologies, but allowed a far greater level of detail. Skene is in fact clearly deeply impressed by the samples of his engraver's work that Charles Tilt sends when approaching him in May 1830. Skene's eventual contribution to Tilt's landscape illustrations was perhaps less substantial than anticipated. On Scott's advice, Skene refused the offer of a partnership in the publication and asked to be paid per sketch. Tilt had hoped that Skene's connections, and above all his friendship with Scott, would assist sales, and was unwilling or unable to pay for more than a small number of sketches. Tilt's published landscape illustrations contain 11 engravings in the end, derived from Skene's sketches. 6 of scenes featured in the published first volume, 4 from the unpublished second, and 1 that appears in neither. A comparison between Skene's etchings and the versions in Tilt's landscape illustrations reveal a stark contrast in finish in the minuteness of detail. So here, for example, is Skene's etching of the old Tweed Bridge near Melrose, as featured in Scott's 1820 novel The Ministry. So here it is etched by Skene itself. And here's the same sketch, polished up by William Westall and again engraved by Edward Finton in Tilt's published landscape illustrations. Or to give another example, here is Skene's own etching of Coldingham Priory, and the same polished up by Samuel Prout and engraved again by Edward Finton. These images show that Skene's sketches were not only employed by Scott as writing aids, but also served as models for professional illustrators, thus playing a major role in how the 19th century public visualised the Waverley novels. Indeed, one intriguing possibility is that some of the later sketches in our recently acquired album were taken when J.M.W. Turner was engaged to illustrate Cadell's 12-volume edition of Scott's poetical works in 1831. Scott asked Skene to supply Turner with sketches of suggested subjects, on which Turner might then base his own designs. In the event, Turner proved much readier to visit localities and sketch from nature than Scott had anticipated. There are, nonetheless, sketches in our album of 8 of the 24 localities that Turner chose for his engravings, including a particularly vivid image of Ravenscraig Castle, or the Raven's Hue of Scott's Rosabelle. Now, none of Skene's sketches of these localities resemble Turner's pictures really in any way, but they may well have alerted Turner to the scene's potential and influenced his decision to select it. So, many of the later sketches in our album are associated with Skene's sketches of the localities of the Waverley novels and Charles Tilt's landscape illustrations of the Waverley novels. There's also, however, further touching evidence of the closeness of Skene's relationship with Scott. In his memories of Scott, Skene writes that in his later years, Scott took great pleasure in making occasional pilgrimages to the farm of Sandinow, overlooked by the old tower of Smailholm, where he spent his infant years in the care of his grandparents, Robert and Barbara Scott, and of his beloved Aunt Jenny. The last time he undertook this excursion, writes Skene, and he seemed to foresee that it would prove to be his last, he became very thoughtful when we reached the wild craggy glen in which the old tower stands. He wandered over every part, stopping at times to gaze in silence at particular spots, the little grassy corners which had been the playground of his infancy, and he made me take drawings of the scene from different points. We lingered there the whole forenoon, and having lunched on the grass, quitted it with regret, which afforded the subject of many early recollections, which Sir Walter seemed to take great pleasure in narrating, adding, "And here I am, an old decrepit man, come to take leave of Smailholm." Now, 2 sketches of Smailholm Tower from different angles in our album, both dated 29th of April 1830, are surely the drawings taken on this occasion. Here's the first one, and here is the second drawing of Smailholm Tower. A further mark of the closeness of the friendship between Scott and Skene is that on Scott's death, on 21st of September 1832, it was Skene that Scott's family entrusted with selecting the items most intimately connected with Scott to be preserved at Abbotsford. Skene also organised the fund for the National Monument to Scott, subsequently erected in Edinburgh's Princes Street in 1840 to 44. There are a few sketches in our album post-dating Scott's death, possibly because Skene moved to Greece in 1838. Skene's third son, James Henry Skene, an army officer, met and married a Greek woman while stationed in Malta. He subsequently sold this commission and settled in Athens, and he sent home such a glowing picture of the climate that Skene set out with his whole family overland to pay him a visit. Enchanted by the landscape, Skene bought a considerable property and built a villa in which he lived for nearly 8 years, 2 of his daughters marrying in the country. Skene toured Greece extensively, leaving over 500 drawings and paintings, including many of the Byzantine monuments that no longer exist. Many of Skene's paintings are held by the National Historical Museum in Athens, including this image of the Temple of Hephaestus. Skene returned to Britain in 1844. He spent the rest of his life at Fruin Hall in Oxford. He died in his 90th year in 1864 and is buried beside his wife in St John's Churchyard, Edinburgh. Skene's memories of Scott appear to have been compiled shortly after Scott's death for the purpose, quote, of preserving amongst his descendants the memory of his intimacy with Scott. He placed the memoir freely at the disposal of Scott's biographer, John Gibson Lockhart, but in the words of his posthumous editor, he seems to have felt and to have impressed the feeling on his sons that to publish it without the permission of his dead friend would be an act of impropriety. He was in fact a great-grandson of Skene, Maurice Skene Taylor, who granted permission to publish in 1909, and another great-grandson, Basil Thomson, who edited the text terribly and prefaced it. Scott's claims to have been Skene's claims to have been assisted in the composition of the Waverley novels have attracted some scepticism, but he clearly cannot be accused of cashing in on his friend's fame or basking in reflected glory. I hope in this talk to have shown that our sketch album provides strong evidence that Skene did in fact act as a visual assistant to Scott, but is not only an intimate and disinterested friend of a novelist, but also a valued collaborator. Besides casting light on Skene's creative collaboration with Scott, the album also finally permits us to appreciate Skene's skill as an artist, undistorted by his limitations as an etcher and unmediated by the polished but impersonal work of Charles Tilt's team of professional draftsmen and engravers. Okay, thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Paul, for giving us an insight, a glimpse into a really interesting professional relationship, but I think also a very poignant and touching personal relationship as well. And personally, I've got a lovely image of Scott and Skene sitting on a hillside with sketch pad and notepad and maybe some interesting sheep in the background trying to have a look to see what they're doing. So I'd like to now open the floor for any questions that anybody might have. I have one perhaps while people are thinking over their questions. Well, at various different points of your talk, I think what I found really, really interesting was the different roles or potential different roles that different sketches could have played between Scott. You mentioned at the end there the sort of part, sort of personal memory aid, I suppose, and then also the kind of potential of the sketches to be either a record that Scott could look at and sort of help to write, but also maybe something a bit more than that in terms of the imaginative touch piece that that sketch could be. But I just think, the versatility of the sketches is really interesting. Are there any that are particularly more well-thumbed than others? That might give a glimpse into which ones Scott was most drawn to.
It's actually good. When you say well-thumbed, it's a good question, because obviously Skene album is evidence would be that Skene tended to lend his album pretty frequently. I'm not sure about that. My impression is that the sketches, for example, the ones at the National Galleries, which obviously drew on my writing, Benton Durwood and Gaius, do look as if they may have been well done. I'm not sure. Certainly, the ones that I showed, the particularly dim sketches of Moffat there, the Grey Mare's Waterfall, the images of Todd Willie do have the do certainly have the air of being pretty well handled. And as I say, it's frustrating that with I think after really numerous efforts, we've not really been able to render those too well digitally. I should have mentioned that the whole album's been digitised and can now be accessed by the library's image collections website. Yeah, I think those ones, the images of Moffatdale, which and of Todd Willie and the Fox Hunt do look as if they were used. You know.
Yes, before your talk, I unforgivably had a look at Wikipedia, so I didn't know James Skene, so I do apologise. One of the pictures that was on Wikipedia was the Porteous Riots.
Was
the Porteous Riots?
Oh yes.
Martin Logan. So I just wondered where I could see them.
Those are in the Central Library.
Ah. Okay.
And I think, yeah, his Edinburgh. Am I going to? No, I think I'm always saying that pretty much all of his Edinburgh. I don't think there are any Edinburgh sketches in the album that we've acquired. It's all landscape, and I think all his Edinburgh sketches are in the Central Library, and they are digitised although the digital images are fairly small.
Oh.
But yeah, there's a good. I think it must be at least 100 sketches of Edinburgh and and its vicinity in the Central Library.
And you mentioned paintings.
Yes.
Because all that stuff was always obviously pencil drawings, etc.
Yeah, there are some in Aberdeen City Museum. There are some in the National. The sketchbook of the National Galleries of Scotland. I say sketchbooks. Some of those are straightforwardly paintings. By and large, they are more. The images he took in Provence, which I think he took at rather greater leisure than some of the sketches in an album, are more finished, and many of them are paintings rather than. And certainly the ones in Greece, and a number of those that featured on it is the website of the National Historical Museum of Greece. You can access those too, yeah. So there is quite a lot of Skene accessible online, albeit some of them are rather more thumbnail sized than complete.
And final question, did he ever try and sell any?
No, he really had a very, if it comes across very strongly in his memories, he has a very strong view of what is not appropriate to a gentleman. And as may have been evident, he really didn't need the money. He was the Rubislaw estate, from which Rubislaw Quarry was a constant source of income, and then he married a banker's daughter. So he didn't need the money, and he did have a very strong sense of what was proper for a gentleman to do. And that was part of, when I say there were all these projects that Scott wanted him to get involved in. I mean, that was part of it. He just was pretty reluctant to get involved in anything which might resemble a commercial venture. Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit more about Skene's involvement in the design of Princes Street Gardens?
Yeah, I don't know very much about that, but yes, there seems to be just a kind of call scheme element to things the Edinburgh Council got up to. No, he was given a free rein to disguise the paths and laws of Edinburgh, of Princes Street Gardens, and did so. I don't know very much about that, and I wonder where off the top of my head, where the relevant archival material was. But yes, when Scott was taking these restorative walks with Skene, following his following the financial collapse of 1826, they were walking on paths designed by Skene. So did anybody? I wonder if anybody in the audience knew a little bit more about that actually. Yeah.
I know there was great interest in German literature in the 1780s and 1790s, but going to a German academic institution must have been pretty uncommon at that time, surely.
Yes, you'd think so. I mean, it does seem to have been his mother's idea that it seems to have happened all very quickly. In fact, the brother, the older brother, that wasn't Devon. Yeah, the brother and heir to the older brother and heir to the Rubislaw estate died very suddenly. But being a gentleman, actually, he basically he took some beleaguered female travellers, women travellers. He took them to a hostelry, gave up his coat, and then rode to other accommodation on a stormy night, caught a cold and died. And the design to pack Skene off to Germany seems to happen very quickly. There was a feeling that he hadn't had any sort of real education. And yes, I don't know if it was a family tradition, but yeah, sending anybody off to Germany in the 1890s does seem to have been a fairly hazardous exercise. But yeah, definitely his mother's idea. Yeah.
He talked about his great wealth and also that he advised Scott on collecting artefacts for Abbotsholm. Did he himself collect artefacts?
I don't think he did. That's a good question, actually. I wonder. Not as far as I'm aware. I'm actually just realising that I have no idea what happened to his estate, because he doesn't, whether he went to live in Mountcurry House on marriage, but then as far as I can see, after about 1816, he doesn't seem to have spent very much time there. So I don't know what happened to his personal collections, and that's something to research, actually. I don't know that he was a great collector. I think he was more inclined to collect on behalf of, he was a member of Society of Antiquaries and things like that. I think he was more inclined to give anything he collected to libraries and to antiquarian societies. Yes.
Could you say again the dates in Greece? I missed them.
The dates in Greece were 1838 to 1845. Yeah, 1838 to 1845.
Okay.
I think it's 8 years because it's the beginning of 1838 to the end of 1845.
And is there? Could you say a bit more about? Do we know what else he might have got up to? Because it's quite a long period to spend out.
Well, his diaries are actually held in the same. His Greek diaries are held in the same institution in Greece as hold all the paintings. So yes, there is a record of what he did, but in fact, I saw some evidence that it had been digitised and there's some effort to be made to publish it. So I could research that, but I've not seen an account of what he did. I'm trying to think, what kind of age would he have been at that point? He would have been in his 60s, early 70s. But he was looking at. I don't have it. There's a photo, a portrait of him taken in Greece, and he looks to be a pretty vigorous man in his 60s and 70s. So he did a lot of travelling. And he's travelling. When I say he travelled in Greece, he also, I guess, he travelled in Asia Minor as well. There are paintings of Izmir and Turkey. So yes, I think he travelled pretty extensively. Is the answer to that question, I think. And
Well, the reason I ask is, you're talking about the sense of what it might be proper for a gentleman to do with their life. And Byron, I mean, that was revolution, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Was he sort of involved civically or politically at all, or was he just there as a kind of travelling?
I think he was there as a traveller. As I say, his son was a military man. I think he had military connections. Skene was pretty conservative politically. He and Scott very much saw eye to eye politically. Yeah. So he's going to. Yes, I don't know what his view would have been on Greek independence. I imagine he was for Greek independence because his daughter did marry, a pro-independence Greek politician. But I'm not aware that Skene himself was. I'm not sure if Skene himself was involved in political matters. But yeah, if anybody was interested, there is a diary. It's a 3-volume diary in a Greek institution.
I've just got time for one last question, if there's a final question.
I was really taken with the idea that Scott had offered Turner Skene to do the do we know what Skene thought of that? Was that very flattering, or did he think, why haven't I been commissioned to do the illustration?
I think this must have been. That's good. Yeah, I wonder about that. I think it must have been in the aftermath of the experience of the etchings, and Scott would have realised by then that Skene hadn't been up to the task of a professional commission. And there's certainly no evidence that Skene was offended. He seems to have been thoroughly disillusioned by the whole process of writing it. The one thing, there is, I don't think I've got the quote, but there's a moment in Scott's journal where he talks about Skene doing the etching. He says something like, I hope it'll do. And it hints that Scott himself was having doubts as to whether Skene was really cutting it as an actual professional illustrator. Cutting it past his yeah. Mm.
Thank you very much, Paul, for answering those questions so fully for us, so thank you for that. But I'd like to invite Dr. Lily Clydesdale to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Paul, for an incredible and thought-provoking talk. And it's such a pleasure to be offering our thanks to you, and in such a beautiful surrounds at the Advocates Library as well. You highlighted that Skene, and you had a lovely quote, him as a visual assistant for Scott. And thank you so much for today being our visual assistant, taking us through the connection between Scott's sketches, Skene's sketches, as an independent man. We heard about his biography first off, and then also bringing to life a lot of Scott's texts and how they related to very real and lived moments. As Lucy said, it is wonderful to have that romantic notion of Scott and Skene scribbling away as they think about what they're going to be, seeing this afterlife of that one moment. So thank you very much for a wonderful talk, for bringing to life the album, for highlighting its history with the Stevenson's family, which is lovely to see those connections coming between Scott's contemporaries, but also the afterlife of Scott's works, and as well for bringing in a really apt edition of the University of Edinburgh on our joint lecture today. Thank you again.